Hi guys, so this session is reviewing the poses which are asymmetrical for the hips. One leg, one hip doing one thing, one leg, one hip doing another thing. And how we can apply the different energetic joint actions of adduction, abduction, internal rotation, external rotation, flexion, extension, to give the pose a little bit more integrity, and especially a little bit more integrity around the hip joints. And from doing this, you work to strengthen and mobilize, and therefore create extra flexibility throughout the rest of the tissues. So, coming into our first pose, which is going to be the lunge position, Anjani Asana. Okay, Anjani Asana, back leg. Working into hip extension, so the back knee, you want to see that it's behind the hip joint here. If you've got a really tight, they might end up just looking like this. Forcing them is going to end up pushing more into their lower back. So obviously guiding them into this position, but asking if they feel the stretch. If they feel the stretch even here, it means they're pretty tight in their hips. If they're not feeling the stretch until here, they're probably not so tight in the front of the hip flexors. Okay, so from here, try as best as you can to square the hips off. It's always nice to add the extra tuck of the tailbone, and I like to work axial extension so that when you come into your hip flexor stretch, because we're in hip extension of the back leg, that doesn't happen where you feel you're just dropping in, and it doesn't feel so supportive here. So lift up, tuck the tail, arms up wherever you like them to be, and I love for this one to really activate as well into the back of the inner thigh, to watch that I'm not just weight bearing on the back of my knee, but I'm pushing through the shin, the big toe to the little toe. And I can really feel the back of my hip, my inner thigh, the front of my hip stretching for sure. And relax. I'm going to change sides and just show you from front ways that we're in parallel here. There's another way you could approach this hip flexor stretch. You could turn this back leg into a bit more hip external rotation. As you tuck the tail and you move forward into here, you will experience possibly a deeper stretch. You may or may not. I definitely am. So there's that variation which might start to get a little bit juicier into that hip flexor stretch, into that psoas stretch. It's a good one to play around with variation as well. Same principle applies. Feel like gravity is not pushing you down, rise against it, add a little posterior tilt of the pelvis, aim high and breathe and focus energy, of course traveling through the spine and keeping that hip nice and active. All right, so that's your Anjani Asana. Coming into your crescent lunge. Once again, parallel. Back leg lifts. This time the knee's not on the floor. The back knee is lifted, increasing that stretch across the front of the hip. Quite a big range of motion. Once again, you can work to square your hips off, having a look at the front waistband and the back waistband are in the same alignment rather than like so. All right, front hip is in hip flexion, back hip is in a lot of hip extension. You can engage this hip extension by engaging the bottom and pushing the foot backwards in space, further trying to extend the hip. Good. From the front foot, you can again challenge yourself and add a little bit more activation by pushing down on the front foot and trying to pull this front hip, which is my left hip, backwards in space. So pulling my thigh bone into deeper hip flexion. By that I mean, I'll change sides, crescent lunge, everything's pretty straight. What can sometimes happen is that hip can shunt forward, and also tuck under can sometimes look a little bit like that. I want you to feel that you have that ability to be able to push down into the floor and pull back, like you're sliding that thigh bone backwards. Yeah, nice and deep here, good deep hip crease. All right, back hip again, I'm going to activate that back glute. I'm going to push that back foot that way. I'm going to stand down onto my front foot now. And one more thing to add on as you can play with the energetics, drive down on that foot, pull the hip back, the thigh bone pulls back, and let's add a little bit of external rotation on the front foot. Try turning slightly from the hip. The foot doesn't move, but you're trying to get that slight rotated feeling here. If that feels nice and energized, stay in that position. If not, just push down and align those hips. your crescent lunge. Same principle applies as Anjani Asana. Try not to dump down too much, lengthen. And when I say dump down, it's not that anything bad is happening. It's just that I want you to feel more energized in the pose by lengthening the crown to the ceiling and the tail away from the crown. Okay, coming into Warrior 1, Warrior 2, Warrior 3. What is the difference? Well, different positions in the hip for sure. I like to do Warrior 2 first, because it's actually easier to access in the hips. So from here, if you can imagine from Tadasana, you step external rotation, abduction, and you lunge into that front leg. The back foot goes back and turns slightly at 45. General rule of alignment used to be heel in line with the center of the arch, but if that doesn't feel good in your hips, you can always take that foot out a little bit further, step it back, whatever feels good. Once you're in Warrior 2, play around with moving the hips, right? So it's going to feel a bit stickly in the hip circles, but allow that feeling of the pelvis, the sit bones, to widen at the bottom. Allow some gentle hip circles and be curious about that movement. Reverse your circles. And notice when you end up, and I'll go this way, when you end up tucking under, you don't get that same range going deep. When you go into anterior tilt of the pelvis, what happens is you're able to access more depth in your hips. Once again from the side, playing with my now, not circles, but tilts. I'm going to tilt the tail under, and I feel quite stuck in my hips. And there's a reason for that. I am stuck in my hips. I'm in slightly pushing the head of the femur forward, and it's nowhere for it to go. So what I want to do is go for a little posterior tilt. I'm going to stick my sit bones back and widen them and get deeper. This allows deeper hip flexion, and then I'm going to add in external rotation. I'm going to drive my foot down and thinking about moving that from the top of the hip, turning outwards. And I can feel that already starting to stretch here and work the outer hip. This hip is an abduction, and it's also an internal rotation. If I increase that internal rotation, there's a lot of load going into my knee, and my foot lifts up, as you can see. So what I'm going to do here is anchor through the three corners of my foot, big toe, little toe, center of the heel, for both feet. And I'm going to push the mat that way as I drive this foot down and go into external rotation. So what I'm essentially doing is abducting, staying in a little bit of internal rotation, and actively externally rotating this hip, which is going to make it pretty strong and solid, right? If anyone tried to push me over, I'm pretty rigid here. A good, strong warrior position. Coming on out. So note, if you do, I'm going to change sides and just reiterate, if you do ever see someone coming into Warrior 2, and it looks a little bit like this, the knee goes on an alignment, the tail is tucking under, and they're trying to go deeper, but they can't. Reason being, they get stuck. There is actually nowhere, not far to budge with this hip joint. Watch from the side. I'm going to go into an anterior tilt, which allows more depth in my hip. Drop into there. Make sure that I've engaged here by pushing outwards into abduction and externally rotating. Notice the difference, nice and relaxed here. Pushing back into abduction, working here for stability. Rotating, a little bit more extra engagement. Much better Warrior 2 as opposed to that, where I just feel a little bit niggly in my groin, not so great in my knee. Play around with that one. Warrior 1. Warrior 1 is actually a little trickier to square the hips off with, and that's usually the cue, square the hips off. I'm going to say, think a little bit critically about this one when you're in the position. So this time the hips are facing forward. You're still in that slight 45-degree angle. And then you're trying to pull your hips square, but there's some sort of resistance. So from here, what's going to happen is you're going to end up slightly pulling that back knee in into the thigh into a bit more internal rotation. And what I actually still want to do is maintain that abduction, that pushing away. So Warrior 1, don't worry so much about the hips. Cue ribs instead. You're able to stand strong into your legs and then bring the rib cage, the shoulders square to the front of the mat, and then go up. That's a pretty awesome Warrior 1, as opposed to forcing and driving down and forcing these joints into position. Changing sides, I'll show you again, but I'm going to show you from this angle. Okay, so we're in a lunge, the back leg. Some people might find it's easier to go outwards to give more space in the hip if it's really hard to get here. All right, this is me trying to get my hips. As you can see, me trying to rotate the hips. I'm compromising a little bit of anchoring in my back foot. So I'm going to do the best job I can to align knee over second and third toe, get that active abduction and external rotation. That's not just at my foot, by the way, that's initiated from my hip, deep in my hip. If I just try and turn the foot, I end up turning just in the knee joint, and we want to make sure we access that rotation here. So play around with that, even sticking your fingers in and feeling, or here, and feeling that that's where the rotation starts from. All right, I'm going to square my rib cage off, arms up. I feel pretty good in this warrior one. I feel really active in my legs. I'm getting the best that I can, getting my hips rotated, but I'm leaving that up to my rib cage to bring everything to the front. Warrior one, really nice variation for it, and much easier to access for most people. Warrior three is our balancing, and usually warrior three is your parallel. Start with this leg. Front leg, the hip is in hip flexion. Back leg, you're taking it back behind you and it's going into hip extension. So I'm going to take my arms out and fold into warrior three, straight back. Oh, she says that she finds her balance. And great. So this is warrior three. This is parallel, this is pretty neutral. What you can do, however, is if you might find some people end up rotating to find their balance. Yeah? Not saying that that's not the good move or a bad pose, but for warrior three, we ideally want to have everything turning downwards, hip bones facing down. What's an easier way to find that solution if you find yourself going into that rotation and find it really hard to get square? Trick is in with the back leg. So this is the back leg, right? When this leg lifts up, it's the non-weight bearing leg. You have that ability to actually, there's some freedom and movement at the hip and that back leg. You can externally rotate, internally rotate, externally rotate, internally rotate. When you're up in warrior three, try to internally rotate. You're going to access a little bit more medial hamstring, adductor, and what's going to happen is it's going to bring you, I'll show you, I'm going to come in and I'm going to lose my balance, and there's that cue, hey, square your hips off, right? From the side, doing this. I'm actually working into external rotation, it's further pulling me over. So, I'll do the best I can to square my hips, but I'm going to rotate at the hip, right in here, turning my knee downwards. And that ends up facilitating an easier way to manage keeping that balance. And it's a fantastic way of recruiting those internal rotators here in a non-weight bearing pose. So it's actually really lovely. You also are not working your glutes as much. There's a different sensation in around the adductor hamstring region. So that's warrior three. One leg is in hip flexion, one leg is in hip extension. The back leg, of course, you can play around with a little bit of rotation to see what suits you best.